Welcome to the Ditch the Struggle podcast. I'm your host, Alana Rosso. I'm a graphic designer turned career and success coach who knew I could do better, but kept falling short of where I wanted to go. But after years of exploring personal and career development, business, money mindset, and energy work, I'm here to tell you that yes, you can move from stuck and defeated to empowered and confident. Ready to dive in? Awesome. Together, let's ditch the struggle. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I have promised that we would have conversations around the nervous system, and we have one today with the incredible Sarah Kleiner. So I'm going to read her bio, and then we will dive right into the conversation. Sarah Kleiner is a somatic experiencing practitioner who is known for deep nervous system nourishment that helps people get out of fight or flight and into a place where they can feel confident, creative, grounded, and able to move forward with the things that excite them most. Clients often come to Sarah with a history of anxiety, people-pleasing, striving for success, and feeling overwhelmed as a deeply sensitive empath. Her work is guided by training and coaching, somatic experiencing, earth connection practices, breath work, Reiki, and soul work. Sarah has worked with entrepreneurs, creatives, healers, and leaders to find the balance of hitting goals, finding creative flow, and nourishing their body and nervous system. You can learn more about Sarah at sarahkleiner.com. Let's dive into the conversation. Welcome, Sarah. I am really excited to have our conversation about the nervous system today.
Super excited to be here. Yeah.
This has been a topic that has been on my radar for a while because I've talked openly about my struggles with anxiety and the things that I've done. I feel like I still have a long way to go. There is always more to learn. And when I started learning about the nervous system, it all started to make sense. And I know this is a passion of yours. So why don't you just tell me a little bit of how you got into this kind of work?
Yeah. It was a long journey because, like you said, there were layers I realized later on. So I'd had a history of anxiety. I'd had some challenging things in childhood. I now would potentially use the word trauma. I wouldn't have back then. I would have just said, like, yeah, there were some hard things. We got through it. But the anxiety was a big part of it. And then I went into a high stress corporate job that really showed me how much my body was going through, that really showed me that there was more under the surface than I knew. And then when some more challenging life events were thrown my way while I was in corporate, it was kind of a real push to explore, like, okay, what do I actually need right now? What am I actually passionate about? What is happening in my body? What am I going to do about all of these emotions and sensations and body pains and things that are happening? So that really started my journey. And then from there, there were a lot of layers. I started looking into starting my own business. I started my own business. And then, wow, that brings more ups and downs and anxiety and stress and things like that. So then that led to support in that realm, which led me to a practitioner who did somatic work. And it was something I didn't think I needed at all at the time. I was like, no, I'm just here for goals. I'm here. I have things to accomplish. I need to grow my business. But then when we started tapping into it, all of a sudden there was this part of my body that I had never really knew could change. Again, having anxiety for so long, your baseline, it's just you think it's who you are. And all of a sudden it was like, wow, that part can relax. Or it's like, wow, that can actually, that voice can quiet down, or that worry could go away. And I started to feel those things and get really curious of, okay, how do I do this on a deeper level? And how do I really try to fix some of these things that I didn't know could be fixed for a long time?
I think what you're saying there is so interesting. This fact, like we think of anxiety and stress and worry as part of our identity and something we have to live with. And we really hang on to it. I think there's also an emotional, almost trauma bond to having those experiences and feelings because it is kind of who we are and it's who we are used to being.
Yeah, and there's actually a nervous system reason behind it, which again, I didn't know at the time at all. I was just like, oh, this is me, this is it. But there's actually a part of the body, especially if we've had stress for a long time, or if it comes from having unpredictability or challenging moments in our childhood, there's a part where it actually feels safer to be anxious because that anxiety is the part that's looking out for us. It's saying like, well, we have to make sure that nothing's popping out of the corner. We have to make sure that no one's angry or that everything's okay. So it's on high alert. to protect us. That's really what that part's trying to do, is it's trying to say, let me monitor everything so that I can best keep my environment okay enough feeling. And so with that, that our bodies can actually be wired to feel a little safer when that's on, if that's been a state of being for a long time. So it's a actual process that is a little more in depth than just like, let's go to a yoga class and relax, to shift that heart to feel like, how do I show my body that it's actually safe enough? And how do I shift that from a nervous system level? Again, it's a deeper process, but it does make sense that there's a part of the body that's like, this is my identity, this is who I am, because it's gotten us through some challenging times in the past.
Yeah, no one gets away unscathed, right? Everyone's going to go through something. So if someone's really not knows nothing about the nervous system, hasn't really heard much talk about it yet, how would you describe the nervous system?
Yeah, so it's a part of us that holds a lot of our natural patterns, essentially. So we always have a body sensation first, and then our mind interprets it. And so our nervous system is the part that is essentially showing our body how we got through challenging times. So we have the nervous system state people are most familiar with is fight or flight. Everyone's heard of that for the most part. That's the part that when we get a little bit escalated is going, okay, something doesn't feel great, so how can I fix it? It's activated trying to fix the problem, trying to solve things, trying to make things better for us because it senses there's something that at least is slightly distressing. And then we can have another nervous system state we go into that's considered our dorsal vagal state, which is that, okay, it's felt like too much and none of what I'm trying is working. And so we can go into a little bit of a shutdown in that dorsal vagal state, which is energy protection, can feel a little bit like lack of motivation, brain fog, overwhelm. It can feel similar to depression. They are two very different categories, but sometimes symptom wise, they're similar. And so these are the states that, again, we're meant to go into all of them, but we can get stuck in some for longer. We can have patterns around certain instances where it's like if someone's really angry, we might have a pattern, a nervous system pattern around that, or if we're really stressed. And so it's that part that is automatically helping our body respond to things and get through them in the way that we're most likely to survive it. And again, survive, I know, is a big word, but our nervous system comes from that primal place of like, if we were animals, it's the part that's saying, a lion's chasing me. How am I going to survive this? Am I going to run away? Am I going to play dead? What am I going to do? It's that we have that same part in us. It's just evolved a little bit with modern day stress being our most likely threat versus being actual like a lion chasing us.
Yeah, and sometimes I think a lion would be easier only because I can see the lion. I can like see what it's going to do. I know I have to get away and run, but some of these outside stresses we have, I don't think a lot of us are conscious of them.
Yeah, and we're not conscious of them, or we're just really good at pushing through. We tend to have People tend to have two patterns from what I've seen from doing hundreds and hundreds of sessions, is we either are really absorbed in a pattern of overthinking, overanalyzing, ruminating. We're spending so long almost steeping in something that's going on, or we have we're going to push it away, push it aside. We're not going to look at that, and we're totally disconnecting from what's happening. And so either way, we're sometimes not exploring those full layers of what's happening and how the nervous system is meant to move through it. And yeah, I think a lot of times it's easier to be in those patterns than to say like, wow, this is uncomfortable here. There's something that's really distressing to my body, or I'm really angry about this, or I was really scared here. Those can be some really hard emotions to be with.
So, how would you suggest someone starts noticing what their patterns are?
Yeah, so sometimes people have a lot of awareness coming into it, and sometimes it's a newer practice. And so, even starting to get a little bit curious of like, okay, if I drop in and notice body sensations instead of noticing the story. So, we're usually really wired to be like, wow, I'm really angry because this person did this or they said this, and we're explaining what happened. We're telling the story of it versus it's really different to go, wow, okay, I feel really angry at that person. How do I know I'm angry? What's happening? Can I notice body sensations? Can I notice like, oh, my chest might be tighter or my palms might get sweaty or I feel all of a sudden like I want to pace around the room. So when we can get a little bit curious about what's happening in the body or notice if that's hard to do, because that's actually very common where people will be like, I don't know, there's nothing there, or I just go straight back to my head. That's how we can start to get some clues of like how big is this experience? Because when something's really big, we'll probably have a harder time feeling those sensations. It'll be like, wow, I can't stay here very long, or I don't notice them, or it's hard to tap in. Versus sometimes when it's a little more manageable, we're like, yeah, I feel that fire in my belly. I'm really angry, but that's okay here. I'm okay noticing that. So starting to get a little curious about that is a way that we usually start, especially with new clients and things in session, to be like, yeah, let's understand what's going on and what it's like to really feel what's happening in the body.
So interesting that you said just a few minutes ago that our bodies are reacting before our brains. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. We have the sensation first and then our mind interprets it.
I feel like that's going to be surprising to a lot of people. Like when you said it, I was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense because personally, I will know. Like I'll start feeling, usually for me, it's cold. Like I get really cold when the anxiety is starting, or else, and even before that, I'll start dropping things. That's like my cue. I'll bump into things and start dropping things. There's not one set of dishes that does not have a piece missing in my house. And I it is really hard for me sometimes to be like, okay, what is going on in my brain? Like I do find it hard to make that connection sometimes.
Yeah. And that's the part that's so interesting to explore is we're so used to validating how we feel when we can explain it, where we're like, oh, it makes sense. I'm anxious because I have a big presentation tomorrow. And then all of a sudden we understand it and it's okay to be that way. But our nervous system can have other cues that we're not aware of. That's like, it could literally be from something that was similar from childhood. It could be something that happened a few weeks ago. It could be an accumulation of things. We don't always know what's causing it. So it's a really different experience to just be with that and start to be like, okay, what are my physical cues that something's off? And then let me just get curious there, even if I don't know why, even if it doesn't make sense, even if it's like, again, especially with anxiety, there's so much rhetoric that most people have heard in the past that's like, oh, you're overreacting or you're being too sensitive or you
Mhm.
shouldn't feel that way. So I think most people with anxiety are used to kind of writing off or pushing through how they feel because that was the way to get anything done or that was how they were taught from other people. So there's something really healing that can happen when we just start to be like, gosh, okay, I don't know why, but I am really wound up right now, or I feel a lot of tightness in my chest, or like the example you gave where it's like, I can feel that something's going on because I'm starting to drop things. What's it like to just slow down here and start to work with the body without even having to know why or justify if it's right or wrong or good or bad or something that will change or not?
Yeah, like do we actually need to know why it's happening all the time? Like do we?
We don't. And
Okay.
I say this to clients all the time where I'm like, sometimes it comes, some people come in, we know the story, we know the context, and some people don't, where we're just like, we're exploring what's happening in the body and the nervous system. And there can be so much healing that happens even with never knowing why. Because again, we can have moments that our nervous system reacts to that go back to conception. We can have pre and perinatal trauma. We can have ancestral genetically passed down
Mhm.
trauma. There's research on all of this. This isn't me pulling it out of a hat. So we can have body patterns that predate any of our conscious memories. And for me, that was a really interesting piece to work with in my own personal journey was how much can come from really early years that actually was the root of a lot of my anxiety, a lot of my body patterns. I had mentally associated quite a bit of it with stuff that had happened later in childhood and it made a lot of sense. But then when I actually started to do this work, we could tap into a place that I was like, wow, that is younger, that is earlier, that is different. And so we almost need to have that openness. Otherwise, we can limit the potential of what we can access and what we can heal with this work.
So it's really fascinating. And I do agree that it is not just about this life or what happened. There's so many layers to it. Do you find there are people who resist kind of thinking that it could be something so far back? They're like, oh, no, no, it has to be this experience. And they're kind of married to that.
For the most part, we can explore it from either angle is really the cool part. So even if someone's like, "No, I know that this was a big moment," we can use any doorway to it. So we can still start with that moment that's like, this caused a lot of anxiety and work through that somatically. And then we just find out if it feels resolved or not. Sometimes it does. Sometimes we work with that moment and it's like, wow, okay, that shifted a lot. And I'm noticing less of the ruminating thoughts, or I'm noticing I have more capacity to try new things. We can sometimes see that, or sometimes it starts to pull back some layers where people are like, wow, okay, I've been feeling, like I said, when we're sensation based, we're sometimes like, oh, it's familiar to feel that
Mhm.
way even before that. Or wow, there's some memories that pop up that were earlier. So it usually unfolds pretty naturally is the cool part where we don't have to predetermine that. Like that's great if there's something we start with and use that doorway.
That's so cool. So tell me, what was your life like before you got into this kind of work? I think you had a corporate life.
Mhm.
I think it was very different from what you're doing now.
Very different. It's almost polar opposite because my first job in corporate was working in crisis communications for an APR agency that supported Microsoft. And so, big company, crisis comms, we had to have very quick response times. We're usually within 24 hours meant to reply to clients. So, we were on call often. So, it was really interesting in hindsight. I can see how my hyper vigilant anxiety nervous system could do really well. I actually like did well in that job. But it was definitely, I could feel how it was taxing. I hit a lot of really challenging moments in that job. And so changed jobs because I thought it was just the job's fault. I was like, this is the stressful job. If I go to a slightly slower paced one, and still found a lot of those patterns were still there. Again, it wasn't as intense because the job was a little slower paced, but still being in that corporate environment, again, it's easy to just blame that as the whole thing, but we bring our patterns in. So it was the catalyst for me to start exploring for sure.
And so, what was the moment when you realized, maybe I need to make some changes here, and maybe this isn't the right career path for me, the right environment for me?
Yeah, it was there were a lot of different blocks in that building, so to speak, because there were I the company I was working for was downsizing a lot. So that was like a very external reason that was like, okay, a lot of my coworkers are leaving. This isn't a stable environment. I'm gonna have to find a new job anyway. So job hunting kind of really made me hit that wall where I was like, gosh, I can't get excited about any of these. I would feel physically reactions, like big physical reactions from looking at other jobs. So there was that. I also had a very big personal life moment where my dad passed away unexpectedly, and it was about a month before I got married. So we had really big life events. And when you're that raw emotionally, both with something really positive and something really challenging, you get really blunt with yourself. There's not a lot of capacity left to hold the other stuff. So I just could feel in my body that was like, I can't deal with these emotions at work right now because all the space is taken up by processing grief and frustration and all the complicated feelings that were in that time. So that those were like two really big ones. I'd also had a lot of percolation in my head about, okay, what's it like to start a business, and I want to get curious and I want to explore my own path of it. But it was definitely a combination of a few different things that all compiled within honestly like a 6-month span that pushed me through that door.
That's a lot to happen within a few months.
It is. It definitely was.
And what was one of the first things you did then, like as an action, tangible step to start moving into a career that you were excited about?
Yeah, I mean, I started really taking skills that I had from corporate and applying them outside of it. So my work at the beginning isn't at all what it is now. I've done 3 plus years of training and one in the somatic and nervous system work and countless mentorships and apprenticeships. So at the time before all of that, I really just started to get curious of like, what skills do I have and where would I prefer to apply them? So at the time, being from more of a PR background, I was like, okay, I have content skills, I have marketing skills, I've done sales, so those kind of things turned into things I was offering small businesses and nonprofits and people I just believed in their work, where I was like, I have this skill set that can help them there. And so that was my foot in the door. And then over time, I just kept asking the question of like, okay, what's really going to make the biggest difference? What's going to help people the most? And that's when, for me personally, I was like, oh, it's less about writing the content or making the marketing plan. I want to do the nervous system work that actually allows people to keep going. Because I would see so many people get stuck where it was like, oh, they'd have the great idea, but they'd have lack of motivation, or they'd have fear of judgment, or they'd get overwhelmed, or they'd change their idea so many times it never got to see the light of day because there was a fear of never being good enough or the perfectionism there. And so I really wanted to work with those root issues that were like, what's happening in the nervous system? And so then that led my curiosity down that path.
So fascinating. And I really want to touch on the lack of motivation piece because I was reading through all of your work and your website, and I know you touch on that. And that motivation piece comes up a lot in clients that I coach with. And I have one friend who it's interesting because I would say she never quote unquote experiences anxiety. She's like my least anxious displaying friend. She's very grounded. She's great in a crisis, but I know she's feeling a lot of lack of motivation, like can't seem to get herself to do things. And it's been going on for quite a few years. And I honestly don't know what to say to her sometimes. Even like the coach in me is like, there's something going on here that I don't know what the root cause of it. So can you speak a little bit to maybe how nervous system and motivation can correlate?
Absolutely. And I always like to caveat first too, of course, there can be multiple reasons for it. It's
Yeah.
never like A to B is always the correlation. But it goes back to when I was talking about the three nervous system states and our dorsal vagal state, which is a little bit more of our shutdown state. This can also sometimes an in between in there is a bit of a freeze response, which can be a similar feeling of like, okay, it's just too overwhelming, or I just get really tired every time I think about doing it, or I just want to do something else. So we have these responses in our system, and we expect in our mind that it's like a ladder where it's like we have to climb every rung to get to the next one, where we think we're like, okay, we're regulated. And then I have to go through that fight or flight, anxious, trying to do all the things, and then I'll get to that shutdown. But again, we have patterns that are pretty predetermined in our body from an earlier age. And it can be a pattern that we almost go through that fight or flight step really, really quickly, where it's like there have been times in the past where it just didn't work. Our body's hardwired to say, like, this is too much, this is overwhelming. And it skips that step and goes into more of that shutdown. And again, it can still be a very functional shutdown. I almost hate the wording shutdown because we picture like lay down in bed, can't get up, can't move. It can still be just like wow, I get kind of brain fog every time I sit down to do it. Or I just all of a sudden always feel called to something else. I have to get the dishes done now all of a sudden, or I like have to go on a walk. Or it can be that just like feeling of, wow, almost all the energy is drained out of my body when I think about doing it. And so that is related to a nervous system state. And it's really important, I think, to acknowledge that because we can be really hard on ourselves in that place.
That's exactly what I
There's
was just thinking. Yeah.
there's so much self-imposed guilt, shame, negative thinking that's like, again, it can be thoughts that are like, well, why am I too lazy to do this? Or I
Mhm.
can never get it done, or I'm not good enough. And then that can compound that cycle a little bit more. That's like those negative thoughts again come back to the way I like to think of the nervous system is we're really watching for any moments that feel like too much or too soon. And so what that means is that can be a sensation, that can be an emotion, that can be an image. It can something is happening, and those negative thoughts, of course, those can start to feel like too much. If we have this inherent part that's like, wow, every time it happens, now I'm thinking that I'm worthless or I'm not
Mhm.
good enough or I'm lazy. And so when we understand, oh, that could be a nervous system pattern, again, that's a really freeing place in a lot of ways.
Yeah, because there can be also the judgment piece. Like when we're calling ourselves lazy and thinking we're unmotivated and not getting anything done and we're feeling like garbage, there's also that space of just judging ourselves nonstop. And then it's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, and I find it's so interesting. There's so few people in my experience who truly have these ideas or have things they want to do and are just actually too quote unquote lazy to do it. I just like haven't seen that happen. Again, it might be different if the ideas just aren't coming or things that, but when there's things where it's like, oh, I want to do this and it's in my mind and there's something that we care enough about to have be a
Mhm.
goal. Of course, there can be some times where we are orienting towards something our body doesn't, we don't really want, where it's like, oh, someone else cares if I run a marathon, but I don't. So there
Mm.
can, of course, be that layer. But if it's something that's truly feeling like, yeah, in my gut, I want this, or this like lights me up and I'm excited, but it's not happening, that's the place where, like I said, I immediately get so curious what's happening in the nervous system to be like, there's something there that's making our body have a response. And sometimes they're misaligned where our brain wants something and our body doesn't. And we can work both ways. We can either work like, oh, do I need to let this go because I don't really want it? My brain has decided it's a goal I care about, but my heart and soul don't. Or sometimes it's like, no, I actually do. My brain wants this, but my body's not on board yet. How do I help my body feel safer and feel more ready to tackle this goal? And we can go both directions.
Mm. And when you start working with clients on their nervous system, what's one of the first things that you start to see them transform or change or how they feel? What's different?
Yeah, it can be so different depending on goals because I have some people who are coming in who are like, yeah, I'm really anxious. I'm really overwhelmed. I know I've been in fight or flight for a while. I don't feel like I can truly rest, or it feels like I'm constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. So with those clients, it can be like, oh, how are we interrupting that cycle? How are we finding moments where the body actually settles? And so hearing them be like, wow, I actually didn't worry about this, or I could have this conversation, this tough conversation with a family member, a friend, a coworker, and I could speak things I never used to be able to because I would always be too overwhelmed. Or I could go give a presentation and pitch my business to a company that I never thought I'd get in front of, or I'm giving speeches for the first time, or I'm making more authentic content that feels like me. So those can be some really big wins where it's like there's space to get creative, there's space to speak up what we need, there's space to change. I've seen some pretty big relationship dynamics change when it's like, wow, for the first time I know what I need and I can speak it to other people and I can have the capacity to hold either if it's met or if it's not met. Like that can change so much. And so on that side, that can happen. Or again, like we were talking about with more the lack of motivation side, it can be something that's like, oh, there's a little more energy, or I feel more tapped into what I care about, or I could tackle something that's been on the to-do list for a long time and I actually got it done. I've had people who've had projects for years where they're like, okay, we're a month into doing the work and they've actually made progress for the first time. And from a place of it feeling okay enough, not a place where they're pushing way past capacity or getting exhausted or things like that. So it all maps back to tangible goals too of what each individual cares about. We don't have to go through anything just for the sake of talking about it or exploring it. We start with things that are like, what are those daily experiences that you want to shift, that you don't like how they feel, where it's feeling overwhelming or you wish this wouldn't happen? We start there. And so it can bring some really tangible shifts to those moments.
That's huge to feel like you can get through something that you've had on the back burner for years and have those conversations and like that is transformational.
Yeah. And I always say they're tools for life because once we learn our own nervous system, we learn how to work with different patterns we have and different experiences, and it translates. So even though in one situation it might be like, oh, I was really overwhelmed having to have this difficult conversation with a coworker, even if the details change and it was like, wow, I was really angry at someone who did something and usually I'd never get to be angry, but now I know how to move it. It's similar tools when we know how to work with our own nervous system, what works to help it settle, feel a little safer, feel okay enough, and what works for expression of it, what works to move that energy again in a way that doesn't feel like too much or too soon for each person's nervous system. And everyone's a little different, but once we learn that, you can apply it to so many situations. And that's one of my favorite parts is where people will message me years later and be like, look, this happened, or I'm still doing this, or it's cool to see this working. And again, there really are tools for life that you can plug in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's the deep work, like the lasting work. That's what I love so much. That's amazing. Okay, you said something about the shoe dropping, waiting for the other shoe to drop. And this phrase also comes up with a lot of clients, and I feel it's really common, especially people who have gone through really tough times, financially, relationship wise, whatever it is. And then things start to actually go well, like things are falling into place. And they are plagued with this feeling that something bad is going to happen. It's all going to be taken away. They don't feel safe.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about that and how that comes up with your clients.
Yeah, it's really common. And again, especially in systems that have had challenging young events, young childhood, there's that part that's just like wired for it. Again, like I said earlier, it kept the body safe a little bit. And so there's a really powerful part of working with that, especially when the good times come, like you said, where it's like, okay, why can't I just be more joyful or why can't I just enjoy it? One really important thing to remember about the nervous system is it all emotions are just big sensations. So it's a big sensation to experience like the biggest joy we ever have. And it's a big sensation to have grief or to have anger or to have fear. They're both categorized as big sensations, and unfortunately, we can't numb just half of it. We can't say, like, okay, I don't want the big fear or the big grief or the anger, but I want the joy and happiness and pleasure and all of that. It's all related to being able, our body, our nervous system, having the capacity to process big sensations. And so there's an element, and we work on both sides of the spectrum when I do work with clients of how are we helping again build that capacity to maybe process parts of how hard those challenging moments were. We might have to process like, wow, I was really afraid in that moment, or it was really scary to have that financial stress, or I was really worried. But then we also, that unlocks us getting to work with that pleasant sensation side that's like, okay, let's see what it's like. What happens when we just get to focus on something that's enjoyable for 30 seconds, a minute, 5 minutes? We can recreate that pattern in session and watch what happens with the nervous system and start to interrupt that cycle. So whatever is there of like, yeah, I can focus on it for a minute, and then all of a sudden my stomach might get tight, or a fear thought might come in, or the chest might get tight. We can understand and start to work with that and loosen that pattern up to be like, yeah, okay, it makes sense why it's afraid. It makes sense why it's worried about it. And how do we interrupt and change that? And so we can do that on both sides. And it's a really important part of this work because I think most people feeling called to it have had a lot of challenging times, very familiar with what it feels like to be anxious or worried or afraid. So at the end of the day, we're not just trying to hang out there more for the heck of it. That's not the point. We want to be like, yeah, let's get that balance. Because at the end of the day, what we're craving is like, yeah, I want to feel content for longer, or I want to really enjoy I always joke like my favorite cup of tea or my favorite coffee in the morning, or when I'm outside in the sun. We want our bodies to be able to really sense that and calibrate to that when it's there. So that's a big part of why we do this work to begin with.
So you mentioned the word somatic, which is the work that you do. And I just also want to go back to a definition of that because I feel like it's starting to really bubble up in a lot of personal development spaces. And I'm not sure a lot of people know what that means. So let's go into your definitions. I love a good definition.
Yeah. So somatic work as a whole is anything body based. So it's really having a body first approach of, okay, instead of just like I said, starting with story and staying in the mind and analyzing, we're really taking the body's experience into consideration. And then my work in particular, I was trained through somatic experiencing, which they specifically do trauma resolution in the nervous system. So it's even a deeper layer of that, of saying, okay, understanding how our nervous system shifts if we've had moments of trauma, how our nervous system might hold different experiences, and actually being able to change that pattern in the nervous system. So there's multiple layers to it.
And would you say, like, what are some of the things that happens when that deep somatic work is being done? Is it just about physical release and physical changes? Is it also the mental piece, I'm guessing, as well? And then do you find like people make different decisions and like there's a domino effect? That's what I'm kind of thinking.
Yeah, it can be as our brain interprets things. If our body's saying, like, okay, I'm anxious, there's a threat here. And then our mind goes searching to define what that threat is, to say, oh, my body's feeling unsafe. Why? And then we find something to worry about. And then we can chase that loop all day long, right? Where it's like worried about it and then worried about that. And so it can absolutely impact the thoughts where it's like, yeah, I'm less worried about it, or I find it's more manageable to think about something. It's not as overwhelming. And like you said, that leads to more different choices, because a lot of times when our nervous system has some default pattern, it's because at least one choice didn't feel like it was on the table. And what I mean by that is, like, for example, if someone's angry with us, it's like, does it feel like a choice to say no to them? Does it feel like a choice to walk away from them? Does it feel like a choice to just ignore them and move on with your day? Likely, some of those feel more accessible to others. All of us have our own default patterns. So for some people, it might be like, I scream right back in their face and that's my default, but it feels hard to walk away without saying what's on my mind. Or for other people, it's the opposite of like, I have to hightail it out of that room. I can't be in there for 3 seconds, but it feels really hard to actually say, like, hey, you're hurting my feelings, or I don't like when you talk to me like that. So in so many situations, we have a default response, and we are at the end of the day working to have all of those feel like choices. Again, every situation is a little different. Which one we pick should differ in different situations, but it does bring back online that ability to choose. It's like, wow, okay, I'd feel okay enough doing any of these three. And I feel like it's my conscious choice to do that. And so absolutely, people will all of a sudden be like, wow, I all of a sudden could speak up to someone and say, like, hey, it's not okay when you talk to me that way. Or, yeah, it was bothering me, so I walked away and then I came back and had a different conversation. And so again, it brings those choices to feel more accessible and to not feel as distressing, ideally, as they sometimes do.
So then I have a question. Why do we ignore our bodies?
Such a good and big question. So we are wired in our nervous system to essentially, if something's unpleasant, for our body to be like, I'm going to try to make that as manageable as possible. I'm going to try to get us through it. It's essentially, again, that survival part. It's like, I want you to survive it. And we can have some pretty uncomfortable sensations in our body. If we think about what big anger or big grief or big fear or terror feel like, really uncomfortable. And so our body is actually trying to do us a favor in a way, our nervous system, to say, this is really uncomfortable. Let me help you get through it. And we can compartmentalize that in some ways. So we're actually wired in some ways to say, wow, if we're terrified, that's a lot to process. So let's disconnect from it for a little so you can get through it. So again, it's like coming back to that animal example, if a gazelle is terrified of the lion, it can't sit there in that moment and think, gosh, I'm really terrified and this is really hard and I just wish I weren't here. It has to act. It has to be like, I need to choose something and get out of this situation and then process. And we're wired the same, but the problem is our threats are different now, most of them. They aren't something that has a necessarily like a solid end, like being chased by a lion does. We have stress that's chronic, that's for years. We have ongoing situations. So our body isn't getting that end point to say, like, this is over, you can process it now, you're okay. And so we carry then those patterns over and over and over again. And again, our body's trying to help us out and it's saying, like, wow, you're really still very afraid. So let's not pay attention to that. Let's disconnect from that a little so that you can walk around every day, so that you can do your job, so that you can have friendships. And so again, it's meant to serve us, but we do need to create those interruptions then, because then when we hold our bodies in that essentially survival state for extended periods of time, that's what leads to a lot of body pains and chronic illness and the fatigue and the overwhelm. So a lot of the symptoms we don't like, even sometimes autoimmune and reproductive issues can come back to nervous system state. There's more and more research on that. And so that's why we have to create those moments to say, okay, how am I showing my body for at least periods of time that it's a little bit safer, that it can process some of that, even if the external situation's ongoing, even if we're not going to be able to solve it in a moment? How can we create that moment for the body to say it's over for at least this half hour or this hour of session, and process them so that we're not holding all of that survival energy long term? And so it really is for our own benefit, and I put it in air quotes, our own benefit, that it's trying to not pay attention. But it also then needs some tools to say, like, how do I make this feel okay enough for my body so that I can reconnect and so that it can process some of those challenging sensations?
Yeah, I know we often, all of us, get frustrated with our bodies, but it really is doing the best it can in that moment with the tools it has, the experiences it's lived through, and where the awareness is.
Yeah, and we're just not taught a lot of this stuff. That was one of the things I was most frustrated about when I did my training. All the time I'd come out and be of training and talk to my husband and be like, "Why did no one teach us this? Like,
Yeah.
why was this not more?" And again, I know the answer is more research has really come to light in the last 10 years. There's more and more evidence, so it's easier to speak to it with more conviction because we have some more of that research to show it. But it's we weren't taught how to process these this way. I always say it's like a new muscle where it's like we're learning how to understand this part of ourselves, how to work with it, and how to find that balance between, again, feeling and processing what we need to, but not being stuck in that place where we're just always thinking about how challenging it was or how afraid we were, where we're experiencing fun things and getting things done and accomplishing our goals and having enjoyment in life too.
Yeah, the enjoyment piece, the fun. I wanted to touch on
Mhm.
fun because I read something in, and I want to talk about your book, Soul Nudge, as well. I read something about like if we're in nervous system dysregulation, it's hard to have fun. Can you talk about that? Because I will say there have been periods of my life where I have found it extremely difficult to like enjoy a fun thing, even if I know it's a fun thing and I've liked it before, but I'm not in the moment. My mind is somewhere else and it actually doesn't feel that satisfying.
Yeah, that was something, and I talk about it a little bit because I remember from some times in my kind of adolescent years in particular, where I'd be doing an activity and I would be like, huh, I guess this is what fun is, but I wasn't feeling. And again, when I would say that, people would worry, they'd be like, oh, you're depressed. Or I'm like, no, it's not that. It's just like, there's not a sensation of fun. I'm just cognitively thinking that this is a fun activity. And that's not uncommon because if our nervous system, again, coming back to those three states, it's our ventral vagal state that is where we feel curious. We feel like we're able to explore. We have that capacity. Because again, if you think about fun too, there's a little bit of that element of like, we feel safe trying different things and we feel safe doing what we want to do. And we're able to be a little bit, sometimes it's silly or sometimes it's goofy or do whatever we're interested in. And so there's that element of safety that goes with it that can dictate. So our nervous system state can dictate what we feel. And also, again, going back to that, we can't numb just one section. If we've have so much of that fear or overwhelm in our body, and we've had to be like, oh, well, I'm shutting that door over and over again, it's also not uncommon then for us to be numbing those other sensations and have a harder time accessing what fun feels like. And so they can go hand in hand. And again, the really beautiful thing is that it's changeable. I think that's the thing that was really important for my system to feel was like, oh, I can actually start to access that more often. And I can A, learn what's truly fun for me, but B, when doing things, be like, oh, I know it's fun because I feel that smile on my mouth or I feel the like sensation of almost like those bubbles of excitement. and start to access that again. It's a really beautiful process to get that to kind of thaw out a little, is what it feels like.
Yeah, because fun and play, like we don't do enough of it as adults, right? We just don't. And I'm hearing some people talk about that, go out and play and have fun and like, get back to that energy. But I find a lot of people struggle with that. And I'm
Yeah.
kind of very curious lately as to why that is. Like, are we just taking life too seriously? Are we just, being really good adults? Or is there some kind of disconnect?
Yeah. And in my experience, like I said, there's usually some other big emotion we have kind of an undercurrent of in those moments that we have that's felt like too much or too soon, that we're having to push aside, that needs some room to shift before that's accessible a lot of times. And again, we can do that in a way still where it's not like a switch where you're like, oh, I have to let out all that fear at once, or I have to let out all that grief at once. We do it in ways that are digestible for the body, that feel okay, where it's processing it. But when we can help kind of reduce that current of whatever other big emotion is really in center stage, then that also usually makes more space for the other emotions to be there.
And have you seen when people are working on their nervous system that they do have that release or change in body pain, body experiences, like how they physically feel on an everyday basis?
Yeah, I've definitely seen that with clients where it was like, oh, I've had this shoulder pain chronically for a long period of time. And then all of a sudden, after we work in some sessions, it's gone, or where digestion's a big one, or
Yes.
digestion is so impacted by the nervous system. So where it can be like, oh, I could have like more enjoyment of food or more smoother digestion. So it absolutely can. And I always joke with clients, it's like, yes, if you stubbed your toe and your toe hurts, that's why it hurts. And it's not a nervous system reason. And we don't have to go and analyze it. But if there's something where it's like, it wasn't an injury, we don't know what it is, especially when it's like tests come back clear, doctors have checked it out, there's nothing, significantly wrong. That's when we get curious about what might come from a nervous system place, because even things like our posture or really minuscule muscle holdings can come from our nervous system state. And so sometimes when it's like, oh, I didn't realize I was that stressed, or I didn't realize I was having that reaction, that can impact how our muscles hold things and create pain and tension patterns that we didn't know why they showed up in the first place.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. And then I'm going to guess that people who are highly sensitive really have a fun time regulating their nervous system.
Yeah. And I would categorize myself in that category. And so it's a little bit of both. We can have some of those that are inherent, I think, what we're born with, who we are, our personality traits. And there can be some parts of that sensitivity that come from, again, if our nervous system's really been on edge and has been like, well, I need to really monitor the situation to stay safe. If people or things have felt unpredictable, if we've had unpredictable environments, some of that sensitivity can come from that protective place. And so we can also sometimes help balance that out by working with the nervous system. And I say again, balance it out, because I still believe we're born with some of that inherently, but some of that parts that make it feel like too much,
Yeah.
where it's like, oh my gosh, I can't even be in this room, or I can't spend more than 30 seconds around this person. A lot of times that we can work with to help balance it a little bit.
Yeah, it's the too muchness. Like that's something I'm very
Mhm.
familiar. It's like, and my tolerance for crowds, too muchness, busyness, it's just getting sometimes less and less. And I can really feel like, because I'm more in tune now with my body, with exactly how I feel when I'm in those situations, when I've left those situations, or in anticipation of those situations. That can also be like, I have to really mentally have a conversation with myself beforehand. And that can stress me out.
Yeah, and that's where that choice comes back into play that I was talking about, of like all options being on the
Mm.
table, is where there's no one right answer. I say this to clients all the time, where I'm like, it's not that our goal is that you have to spend 5 hours there and that's the win. It might be that it's like, oh, okay, when it's really uncomfortable, do I feel okay enough noticing that discomfort? And do I feel okay enough, like in my body, saying, like, gosh, I don't like it here. I want to leave. I feel uncomfortable. And then do both those choices feel like options? Because sometimes we might really want to stay. It might be like, this is a concert of my favorite band and I hate the crowd, but I love the concert. How do I build capacity so I can be here and enjoy it? Or sometimes the right answer is like, wow, it's really crowded in this mall and I actually don't want to be here at all. And I need to just leave because that's what my body's telling me. So it's being able to explore that nuance as well. That's like not feeling like we can't do the things we want to do and like it's a limit, and more having it be in that choice category of like, okay, I have these choices and I know what's happening in my body, but all things feel like options.
Yeah, I think we forget we have choice in most situations.
Yeah, exactly. And when we build that capacity for that discomfort where we're like, don't like it here, I'm not enjoying this, it's not great, but I can still feel that and keep that choice online. It's a really powerful place because, again, sometimes we have to do things that aren't that fun. And again, we can so easily go into one pattern or the other where we're like, I only do things that bring me joy. I'm pushing it all out. I don't want to do any of it, which sounds great in theory to just be like, let's only do what lights us up and let's have but A, that's not life. And B, sometimes the things that bring us joy take moments of really big discomfort where it's like, I'm going to have this conversation or I'm going to have to physically do this thing. So we need that capacity to be like, yeah, I can be uncomfortable or unhappy or angry or not or anxious and be okay enough so that we can have those choices to get to the things that we might really want.
Yes. We have to embrace the choice and remind ourselves that we have it. And it's really empowering when you even start there.
Yeah. Yeah. And even micro choices too, because I know a lot of times I want to make sure I call out consciously. Sometimes we don't have the biggest choice we'd want. Like a great example is if someone's work is really challenging or toxic, but they can't yet quit because of a financial situation. I always really want to call out that yes, we may not have our like choice A, but there are still ways we can help the nervous system feel choice within whatever parameters there are so that we can still get a sense of that. That's like, okay, I might not be able to put in notice today, but how can I help my body feel, notice what moments feel most overwhelming and have choice there? Because we might have the choice that's like, all right, every day at 2, I have this really awful meeting and I feel really anxious before and really drained after. What choices do I have around that time period that can help my nervous system? So we can break it down like that. And again, I think that's just important to say because I think sometimes without doing that, we're not acknowledging the nuance of
Yes.
how what life can be like and how sometimes, yes, we don't have every choice on the table, but we have ways to create that sensation of choice.
Yeah. And I love that term micro choice. That's a good one.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's huge to still feel and to work with, and it's again how we can support the nervous system within whatever life reality is, which again is something I'm so passionate about because I think too often it becomes big sweeping generalizations. It's like, well, everyone should quit the job they hate, or everyone should leave the relationship when they're unhappy, or everyone. And again, there's so much more nuance. And I think we, when we don't discuss that, then people don't feel called to those tools that still might help because they're like, well, she's just going to tell me my job sucks and I should leave it and I can't do that. But when we go, no, okay, great. If the job needs to be there, how do we support the nervous system within what's happening? There, again, that can really be a settling moment for some people's system to feel that that's still an option and that we can create some of those choices.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking like supporting the nervous system and understanding how to support your nervous system while you're looking for work, while you're going through maybe a tough job, but still having to interview at new places and go through that, that would be golden. That is
Yeah.
huge.
That's sometimes the most important phase is when there's external things that need to happen, but maybe we can't control when they're going to happen, or maybe it's going to be a while, but we're in that phase of like, okay, it's out of my hands. How do I help my system feel okay enough in this period? Again, those are sometimes the most crucial ones that we don't wait for the external circumstance to make it better. We don't wait like, oh, well, I'll feel better in a year when the move is over. I'll feel better in a year once I have a new job. Again, like I mentioned earlier with my corporate work, we still take our same patterns with us when we do that. And so it might show up in a different way. And we might, sure, there might be some relief for sure if it's a really toxic job and a less toxic job. 100%, we might build some capacity through that shift. But there still usually is some processing that needs to happen. And when we can do that proactively, we increase the chances that you're in tune with like, yeah, this is the job that feels right, or this is the best choice for my system, and free up some space for that.
Yes, that is amazing. And that kind of will feel, I think it will give people some inspiration as they're kind of going through any big decisions they have to make because we can't control the external. That's one of the most common questions I get. How long is it going to take to find a new job or whatever it is? And navigating that is a challenge, but that's
Yeah.
amazing. Yeah.
And it's again one of those skills for life to say, like, how do I support my nervous system in times where I don't know what's coming, or there's a lot of uncertainty, or there's change, or there's big decisions to be made. Those can all be dysregulating experiences. And so knowing how to help our nervous system, again, one of the biggest tools for life, and also frees up so much when we're like, okay, it's not that it feels great all the time. I want to normalize that. It's not going to make it so it's like, I don't have a care in the world, but it can keep it, instead of it feeling like, oh, I'm at an 8 or a 9, I'm really maxed out, I'm really overwhelmed, it's on my mind all the time. And maybe bring it down to a 4 where all of a sudden we're like, yeah, okay, this is hard. And I can acknowledge there's emotions here, but there's still space to go enjoy other things in the meantime. Or I still feel curious and open to all my choices while I'm in this in between. Again, that's a nervous system state, to feel curious and to feel like we can problem solve and like we can try different things. That is directly correlated to a nervous system state. So if we want that ability to say like, well, there might be other solutions, or I want to be able to create something or get curious or try something different, we have to support our nervous system in being in a state for that to be possible.
Absolutely. So tell me a little bit about your book, Soul Nudge. I know that you put a lot of love into this book, and there's some beautiful messages in it.
Yeah, so that book was especially really focused on my time kind of like growing up a little bit and going into corporate and then starting my business. So I really wanted something to document like, what is that process like of getting familiar with ourselves, what lights us up, what we want to do in the world. And so it was really meant to capture, again, both stories and tangible tips and questions. And I have a whole workbook that goes with it too, to understand, like, let's get familiar with ourselves, our own soul's voice, and what that's like. Because again, that was such a huge part of the process for me as someone who had a lot of anxiety. I didn't really realize until later how many of my choices were based off of like the lowest risk, or my anxiety has analyzed every situation and this makes the most sense. So there were things that I at the time was totally saying I wanted. I was like, I want this. These are all my choices. I had plenty of room for choice, but a lot of it was dictated by that voice. And I didn't realize that until starting to really drop in with my body, do some soul connection work, and be like, what is this like for me? And so I'm really passionate about that part. And again, the nervous system, of course, plays into it, of how we get familiar with that part of ourselves so that we aren't just operating off of what was expected of us or what anxiety has told us to do or things like that.
Yeah. And getting out of autopilot.
Yeah. Yeah. Because again, we think we're choosing a lot, but if we haven't really spent that time to get familiar with that place, and again, there's layers of, sometimes it feels easy. Sometimes we're like intuition strikes and we know it. And sometimes it is because our nervous system is dysregulated, feels really hard to access, or it's a little bit clouded, or it leads us in a direction we didn't expect because we're feeling really anxious about something. So it's such a powerful, yeah, powerful place to play around with, to understand what your sensations are and how to get familiar with that.
Yeah, I highly recommend that book. And I love that you have a workbook because everyone knows I love a workbook. And you have to do the work. Like, that's the thing. Like, it's one thing to absorb the information and read it through, but it's sitting down and just doing those little exercises. To me, that's like always one of the things I kind of recommend to people if they're really wanting to make some shifts.
Yeah. And I'm just all about things being useful in day-to-day life. I think there's enough rhetoric of the theory and the the inspirational thoughts, but then when it comes down to like what's actually going to make day-to-day life feel different, what's actually going to plug in a useful way, I really wanted to have both, again, the stories that help us connect and help us understand the broader concept, but then also like those real questions that make people dig deep into themselves and their own individual experience and get to know those places.
Oh, it's amazing. Now, in the spirit of ditching the struggle, what would you say is the most important thing for someone to commit to?
Yeah, I think committing to that process of the phrase I sometimes use is befriending your nervous system, but getting to know your own patterns and your own body and what it needs and what supports it and what regulates your system. Because I think a lot of times we're struggling when we are having to like push through something. And that can be something feeling like too much or too soon, or we feel alone. We're struggling because there's some big emotion or sensation there. And so when we can actually be like, wow, I've built these tools in this relationship with my nervous system so that I know how to support when it's feeling those big emotions or sensations, that changes so much. Like I said earlier, they're really tools for life and they really can help us. It's not that we won't ever feel anything challenging again. We're still going to have moments where we're scared or frustrated or sad, but it might make those emotions feel like less of a struggle and make them feel more like something we understand how to work with and process and support.
Yeah, and when you say befriend your nervous system, which that's amazing. Like that is such a great thing to do. And I don't think a lot of people have thought about it, and I've never thought about it that way. It's to me, it brings up words like alignment, connection, self-love,
Mhm.
um, acceptance. Like I feel like it brings up so much harmonious emotion and energy if we're thinking about our nervous system and how we're operating.
Yeah, and it's something that I really believe in bringing. It's something actually I've had feedback from a lot of clients that they're like, there is such deep compassion that is healing for those moments because, again, it's so interesting how our most challenging moments for our nervous system, they're sometimes what happened, the actual incident itself, but there are oftentimes how other people responded to it after that contributes, where we're like, okay, I felt criticized or I felt alone or I felt judged or someone got angry. It's been so fascinating to me as I've worked with so many people how often, like I said, we think it's the incident and then that part after. So having that space where someone's holding really deep, compassionate space where we're feeding your nervous system with that like understanding that's like, okay, this may not be the reaction I love, or I may not love every symptom of it, but there's deep understanding and compassion for why it's happening. Again, the depth that can heal was truly mind blowing to me. And I think it's really powerful for most people to feel.
Oh, absolutely powerful. So, Sarah, how can people find you and how can they work with you?
Yeah, so I have my website is just my name, so sarahkleiner.com. I also offer free consults for people. So I'm really passionate about this being information in people's hands, that we get these resources out there. Like I said, when I learned it, I was like, why haven't I heard of this? So if you just have questions or you're curious or you have things going on that you're like, I don't know if nervous system work would be good for this, but I'm curious, there's free consults for that. So that's at teawithsarah.com. And then, yeah, I also am on Instagram as well with getting some resources and try to keep sharing some educational tools there. Those are usually some good ways to start.
Well, I so appreciate this conversation because I am personally becoming obsessed with the nervous system. And you've done such an amazing job of just helping us, I think, put the dots, like connect the dots and think about our nervous system and our bodies in a very different way. And I love that we kind of ended with compassion because our bodies, as I said before, they're doing the best they can. And we have to give it some love.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a powerful way to do it.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today and joining us. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Okay, take care. Thank you for joining me today on Ditch the Struggle. You showing up here means so, so much to me. To dig deeper into the topics discussed today and to learn about my work, visit alanarosa.com. And don't forget to download your free resources while you're there. And if this episode resonated with you, please share with others who also want to ditch the struggle. Go ahead and subscribe to the podcast, leave a rating and a review, and let me know what you'd like to see more of on this podcast. And before I go, I want to leave you with my 3 favorite ways to ditch the struggle. Be your own best advocate, take baby steps for the win, and forget about a linear career path. It's overrated and you are doing just fine. See you next time.